outcome am I looking for? So maybe I'm looking at a cancer cell and I don't want it to proliferate. Or there's a virus and I don't want it to replicate. Or bacteria, I don't want it to grow. With any of these processes, there are proteins, there are enzymes, there's some pathway of interest that we're thinking about. And so we have some kind of target in mind that we want to intervene with in order to have some kind of outcome. All right, so the next thing is we need some molecules that then engage that target. And in doing so, we need to have a number of tests in place, right, that utilizes this target. So we take a bunch of molecules and we throw them at these different assays or tests, and then we ask questions about what's a good molecule and what's not. So you start with a whole bunch of molecules and you really funnel it down through all these tests to just those that you're most interested in. And so I like this depiction of a bullseye, right? So we start with all these molecules, and you're looking for those that kind of hit the bullseye. And in truth, I'm here to tell you, very rarely do they hit the bullseye, right? So the compounds that come out of this process are not really great, but they kind of have that fundamental inkling of something interesting that we're going to follow up on. And the closer you are to the bullseye, the less time this whole process will take, okay? So once we have these compounds that are at least on the grid, we call those hits, right? Those hit molecules are really interesting to us because then we can test them and try to hone them. And so that's where this concept of molecular tuning comes from. We start with our molecules, and using the art of chemistry, we break bonds, we change the structure of the molecules, and in doing that, we change the function and the properties of those molecules. And so we're really good friends with our biologists who will test those compounds through all of those different testing strata that I showed here. And so every change that I make in a molecule leads to a different type of compound that has to get tested. So you can imagine we make tens and hundreds and thousands of compounds. Right? And so if the compounds get better and better, we call those leads, right? So now they have the right kind of attributes that we're even more interested in them. If they get good enough, we want to take them into animal models, right? And we usually start with the mouse, right? So we start with this small mouse, and we start with healthy mice. So we take the molecule, we put it into the mouse, and we say, does this molecule get to its target? Is it there in sufficient concentration? And does it do no harm? Right? And if it passes the grade there, then we might move into a mouse model where it's infected or it's sick in some way that kind of ties back to our target of interest. And so we go through this process of iteration of optimizing our molecules, tuning them, right? Changing the structure. We'll make a molecule and it's worse than what we started with, right? And then we'll make another molecule and it's better. And all of that data comes back to us and we use it to change the structure and optimize the molecule. So if this process continues and we get better and better, we're lucky enough to move into higher species. So those could be rats, ferrets, pigs, dogs, monkeys, pretty much any molecule that will recapitulate what we want to see in a human model, right? So we're testing, does the molecule work? And does it do no harm? And ultimately, if it passes the grade all along this pathway, we eventually get to clinical studies, getting molecules that work in humans, and eventually something that's broadly available for humans for which this molecule has been designed. So your friendly neighborhood medicinal chemist like myself works in this yellow box, right, which is affectionately known as the Valley of Death. So many molecules actually fall out during this process, and they don't make the grade, right? So we make many different types of molecules. We try to learn as much as we can, as quickly as possible. But not many molecules actually make it through. And in fact, in clinical studies, many molecules will fail as well. So we try to do our due diligence, but it becomes really important that we start with good chemical matter. So the timeline to approval for this process is on average about 10 to 18 years. The cost can be anywhere from 1 to 2 billion per molecule, and the failure rate's about 90%, right? So when you look at the molecules and the drugs that are available to us, it's really remarkable, actually, that they're there and available. As I mentioned, it becomes really important that we have high-quality chemical matter to start with. So where does this come from? Where do we find it? Well, it can actually come from a number of different sources. We can design it computationally. We can go searching in the oceans and the soil and dig up different natural products and analyze those. Or we can create them with chemical methods. So we can actually build out chemistry that allows us to make new types of molecules, and then we can send those out into the world and look for opportunities where they might actually be beneficial. And so in the rest of my time here, I just want to share with you one little vignette out of my lab working on alpha viruses and superimpose this on this drug development pipeline and show you kind of how it works in action. All right, so alpha viruses are a family of viruses. In this particular case, we're looking at those that cause brain inflammation in humans. They are transmitted through the bite of an infected mosquito, and so these are propagating throughout not only the US, but elsewhere. And they come in different flavors, like Baskin-Robbins. So we have 3 different variables up here. And you can see in yellow, I've highlighted what the human mortality rate is associated with each of these. And so for something like VIV, it's relatively low. But triple E, which was manifesting in Massachusetts and Vermont and New Hampshire in August and July, the fatality rate is about 50% or higher. So we get concerned because there are no vaccines available for these viruses. There's no therapeutic drugs that have been approved. And unfortunately, several of these are bioterrorism threats, or we are concerned about them in terms of their pandemic potential. And so we really need some kind of therapeutic that we could utilize to help those individuals who contract this particular infection. So let's go back to our pipeline, right? We have a target. We have a virus in mind, and in this particular case, we're interested in the replication machinery, what allows the viruses to replicate and grow. We started with 350,000 molecules, right? And we started looking at those tests that keep infected cells alive. So if there's no intervention, an infected cell will die. And we don't want to kill healthy cells, right? We want our molecules to be safe. We also want these molecules to have attributes like they're soluble, right? You can work with them, you can test them, we can synthesize them, right? That's always good. And a number of other properties that endow them to be drug-like and move down the pipeline. And furthermore, we want them to stop viral replication. So we can test all of these molecules. And if you look at the bottom of this funnel, where we started with 350,000, we ended up with 5, right? 5 molecules made the grade. So I'm showing you a depiction of what I prioritized as a really good molecule to start on. And I show you these shaded regions of color to highlight where we focused chemistry. So we developed different methods that allowed us to tweak each of these individual spaces. And in doing that, that led then in each case to a new molecule that then had to go through all of this testing. So we found our hits, we optimized these molecules, and that led us down a different path. So how many of you are familiar with Transformers, the movie? Yeah, you've heard of it? So trucks, vehicles, they turn into robots and vice versa, right? Well, we discovered our own transformer, right? So this was a cool day in the lab by which we take one molecule and under the right reaction conditions, it modifies, transforms into another molecule. And in this case, it doesn't go back and forth. It actually stays on the molecule to the right. This turns out to be a new rearrangement that no one had described before, new architecture that no one knew about, and it also turns out to be exponentially better antiviral chemical matter than what we started with, right? So this is pretty cool. We're all very excited about this. And so we still engage in this molecular tuning because it still needs optimization. So we take this molecule and we continue to modify it with chemistry, ultimately ending up with these types of molecules shown here, which are further improved in terms of their properties and their antiviral activity. So we move down the pipeline. We're now at the lead stage. We put these into healthy animals. They work well. We put them into the sick animals. They work extraordinarily well. And then we move on to these higher species. And so currently, this is where we're at. And there's a number of other activities that have to happen along the way. So we start with all of this chemistry front-loaded. And it's really wonderful for making different types of analogs and that tuning exercise that I told you about. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty of you need to make tens to hundreds to thousands of grams of compound, you have to change the chemistry. And so we've been doing that, and we've scaled up. And now these compounds have moved into non-human primates to look at how safe they are and how well they work. And so we hope to move to the end of this pipeline in the near future. I just want to leave you with how important it is that we all work together. This is a multidisciplinary field. Much like when you're composing a symphony, you bring together all these different instruments, and they have to harmonize and work with each other such that you get something functional. And drug discovery and development is no different. So the chemists, the pharmacologists, regulatory, the biologists, all of these individuals have to come together and work together to make this pipeline a success and ultimately, hopefully, end up with molecules that impact human health in a very positive way. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, hello, good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me properly. I see some nodding, that's great. So I'm Jose. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Dermatology, and I'm super excited to be here, to be honest, but I have to make a disclosure. When they told me the topic that I was supposed to present, I kind of don't want to do it, to be honest, because my colleagues have much better topics. The previous one was talking about building molecules, adding atoms. The previous one was about the universe. That's Star Trek, Star Wars, Jedi Knights. You can't be cooler than that. And then they say, Jose, this is your topic. Development of cancer. So it's a Friday, I'm from Spain, it's cold outside, I don't like cold, and I need to present about cancer, which is super sad. So I said, okay, I'm gonna try to add it at my own spin by showing what we do in the lab to try to help this terrible disease, okay? So I'm gonna talk about cancer development because I said I was gonna do it, but I'm also gonna add a layer of engineering and also harmony. And probably this one is the one that is gonna raise some eyebrows because you're gonna say, harmony. That's normally what musicians do, right? When they play together, think about an orchestra, right? We have a bunch of people, 20, 50, 100, very skilled musicians playing beautiful violins, the trumpets, the cello. I don't know more instruments, I'm no musician, but Dan knows. You get the idea, right? So think about the human body, honestly, like an orchestra, but you don't have 100 instruments or 100 musicians inside of your body. What you have is more than 30 trillion of cells. I'm gonna say that number again. It's 30 trillion with T. That's a number that is very difficult to wrap your head around. So just as a metaphor, if you take each of those cells and put them one next to the other, almost like making breadcrumbs, that line of cells is gonna be larger than Camp Randall. It's gonna be larger than the state of this Wisconsin. It's gonna be around 1,000 kilometers. Sorry, I'm from Europe, so that's about 700 miles maybe. You get the idea. It's a lot of cells, right? And like I said, in an orchestra, you have the violins, the cellos, all playing in harmony together, right? Your human body also have different cell types. You have more than 200 cell types, right? So when you do a very easy task, think about me just pushing, this option, or just moving the microphone. That's a lot of neurons issuing the command, traveling through your spine, telling what muscles you need to move, what ligaments you need to contract to just simply pick up your phone and check the news, right? So that's a lot of cells that every single second of your life, they are working in perfect harmony. So your body, you can think of a highly skillful orchestra that is working all the time together. So with this, now you know what I mean about biological harmony. So I'm gonna move to the second concept, okay? How is it possible that we have 100 musicians, right, playing all the same song at the same time? It's because they all agree to speak the same language. This language more specifically, right? That's a music sheet where you can see your B minors, G minors, I don't know more, but whatever it is, right? So that's exactly what you have in the human body. That's your genes. Basically, inside of each of your cells, you have an instructions manual made of genes. Here, I think you have 7 chords or notes that you can play. In the human body, you only have 4. So think about your G minors and all that stuff. You only have 4 letters, C, G, A, and T. And what makes your cells what they are is the specific sequence of these letters. So if you know how to read this, now you know you can read what this means. So all your cells have the same manual. So they all can behave at the same time in harmony. Does it make sense? So now I move to the second one, that is Cancer. So using again the example of the orchestra, it's like you have 99.9% of the musicians working together, going to practice, beautiful stuff. So it's the day of the concert, right? And again, the cellos start to play softly. Maybe the piano joins in. I said 99.9 for a reason. In every single group, there is a guy or a girl who thinks they're the rock star, the diva. In this example, it's going to be the singer. And when it's their time, they didn't show up to practice. Instead of this, they storm into the room, playing Guns N' Roses. At the tune of this. Don't get me wrong, I love the song, I think it's a good song. But if you play this scenario in your mind and you put those things together, they don't play together, right? In order to create this harmony, this movement of muscles to be able to move in a coordinated manner, you need your cells to cooperate. So that's what happens with Cancer. Your cells, instead of working continuously, they are doing whatever they want, one of them. Why is that? So it's basically because this genetic code, these genes, is damaged in those cells. For whatever the reason, that cell has experienced some damage in their DNA. So now they are missing some letters. So imagine that here I delete one of those T's, one of those G's. If now I start to read this sequence, you are out of tempo. You play when you are not supposed to. And that's going to stick out like a sore thumb. Your conductor is going to signal you out. So that's basically what is happening with a Cancer cell. As they accumulate more and more mutations, they stop to respond to your commands. They start to grow when they are not supposed to, right? So that's what is going to lead, to cancer development. When you have a cell that, because of that mutation, starts to grow. Think about maybe the skin cancer, melanoma, right? And continues to grow even bigger, accumulating more mutations, starts to invade deeper into the skin. At some point, it can even reach the blood vessels in your skin. That's what is known as metastasis. And once that happens, now that cell can travel to your brain, your lungs, your heart. And this is why I didn't want to do this, because this topic is very, very sad. So I know that most of you at this point, you are thinking it's 7, 8, 9. I could be at home eating some popcorns, watching some new movies. Gladiator 2 came out today. I think it's pretty good. Why am I spending time with Jose here? So I agree with that, by the way. But if this were a movie, this is the low point. Now it's time for maybe a hero to show up and do something, and that's medical science, okay? So the University of Wisconsin, where you guys here living here in Wisconsin, is actually one of the best ones at cancer treatment, more specifically at immunotherapy. Who's the hero of this story? It's actually your immune system. Your immune system, we've studied this for the last decade, and we've seen that it's one of the best tools you have to stop cancer. How is that possible? So if you remember, I said that your cancer cells, right, they accumulate those mutations. So they behave in a different way. They look different. All those are signs for your immune cells to recognize them and just kick them out. And actually, very often, they destroy more than 90% of the tumor cells that try to create an invasive cancer, if that makes sense. So think about your immune system almost like the army, right? You have your airborne, Navy SEALs, special forces, whatever you want. So here you have the equivalent, B cells, T cells. We need to work on the names, on the branding. But some of them are pretty cool. Some of them are called natural killer. That's a badass name. So UW works with these ones and also with T cells. So what do we do in the lab? We're going to take these cells, these natural killers that are really good at detecting cancer, and we're going to train them. We're going to tell them what mutations they are looking for in that cancer, okay? So again, sorry you missed Gladiator 2 today, but I brought you a movie. It's not that good, I promise. But here's what you're going to see, and I'm going to introduce the characters. So you're going to see in red, these dots, those are tumor cells. In green, you have immune cells, right? Think about, again, those are the heroes of this story. They are outnumbered, they are the resistance, and in blue or cyan, you are going to have dead cells. So John, if you don't mind, do you mind playing this? So this, what you're going to see, right, is basically 12 hours in the life of an immune cell. So you can see that the red cells, they don't move that much, the cancer cells. But the green, they are super, super fast. Immune cells are incredibly fast. Doesn't matter how much tumor cells try to run, your immune cells are going to catch them up. And here you can see the results. The number of dead cells, again, it's cyan, it's in blue. At the beginning of this trial, there are almost no dead tumor cells. After just 12 hours, you've destroyed maybe 20%, 15% of the tumors. That's really, really good, right? So that's what we say, okay, perfect. That's working in some of these Petri dishes, that as my colleague was saying before, that's what we use in the lab. So now we have identified one of those lead compounds, right? Now we just need a little bit of time. And when I say a little bit, I mean 12 years to move from this to the clinic. Why is that? Because these tools that we have in the lab, they use one cell in a Petri dish. Humans were more complex than that. We have multiple organs, multiple cell types. Is there a way we can speed this up? So here is where the last concept of my talk is going to come useful. We've talked about cancer development, right? Harmony. So now I want to use a little bit of engineering. How we can use engineering that seems so far from medicine to basically fill or bridge this gap. So what we're going to do is we're going to fabricate, 3D printing? Most people know about that, is building objects in 3D. So we are using techniques like 3D printing to basically build small devices. Those are my fingers in blue. So they are very, very small, where you're going to have teeny tiny chambers connected by teeny tiny channels. And in each of those chambers, you're going to have like a tiny microscopic liver and a tiny microscopic kidney and a brain and a neuron, whatever it is. So basically you are building almost like a teeny tiny representation of the human repertoire of cells. So this is going to lead you to results that are going to represent much better what happens inside of a patient. Now you have all the cells that you need to see if that treatment is going to be effective. So I want to show you again just some of the videos that we're getting on the lab, okay? This was done in that plate that we use. This was done against a 3D tumor mass that you could see on a patient. So John, if you don't mind, can you play the top one? So this is a tumor mass, and in green you can have the immune cells. So you can see that in 5 hours, you have the time at the top, right? The tumor now is swarming with immune cells, okay? They are really fast at penetrating inside of them. So now, John, if you don't mind now, let's move to the second one, because I said that immune cells are very fast. They are also very nimble. You're gonna see that. You can see how they squeeze, how they change shape so quickly. That's 90 minutes. They can adjust their shape to basically penetrate between the gaps that the tumor leaves to hopefully attack the tumor, punch the tumor from the inside. Let's see, let's put that idea to the test, shall we? So if you move to the last video, John, thank you. Again, in red, you have the tumor, the tumor mass. In green, you have that NK cell, that immune cell. And in blue, you are gonna see dying cells. So you see that immune cell that was here, now it's hiding behind that cell. Now it's here, coming back. Now I don't know if you can see how those tumor cells now are turning blue. That's signaling the impending doom of those tumor cells. Those are gone forever in just like 7 hours because of the action of one cell. So now, that's what we've done in the lab. Let's see how this is working with the patients. So again, we've used for decades treatments very aggressive, like chemotherapy, radiotherapy, right? In some tumor types, the survival rate it wasn't the best. It was like 30%. So now I want to show you the results that we're getting with immunotherapy, some of them done here in Wisconsin, in Madison. So here you have the results in Pennsylvania, Baltimore, New York, and Seattle. That number, you see that, is the survival. In some of them, we've gone from a 30% to a whopping 93%. So that's the kind of breakthrough that you see once in a generation, okay? And this is why immunotherapies won the Nobel Prize in 2018, and now is the first-line treatment for so many tumor types, used in the US, also in Europe, in Asia, worldwide. Like I said, it won the Nobel Prize, and I think it's a beautiful example of the kind of things that you can get when you combine different disciplines working together, like biology, genetic engineering, biomedical engineering, and medicine. So again, this is not as exciting as maybe Gladiator 2, but hopefully this gives you an idea of the kind of things that you can accomplish in science when you bring different disciplines together. So with that, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great night.
I've got this. Oh, that's, yeah. Thank you for coming. My name's Morgan Robertson. I'm from the Department of Geography, and because I'm a geographer, development means something quite different to me. Development to a social scientist has a resemblance to the kinds of development we've discussed so far, but when we talk about development in the social sciences, it's a social process. And we're talking about development towards, or progress, or change, towards, say, the Enlightenment ideals of the foundation of the United Nations, Western liberal democracies, universal human rights, environmental justice, freedom and prosperity for all. Change towards that is often what we refer to as development. If we're narrowly considering wealth and production, we may just talk about economic development. But we face the same tension as those in the medical and physics sciences about the concept. Is development, and I encourage you to sort of meditate on this, is development an organic process, the natural unfolding of the inner potential and inherent nature of a being, as we heard from, or an object, as we heard from Peter? Or is it something that must be imposed or guided or managed, funded, implemented, as we heard from Jennifer? Experience suggests that it can go well or poorly, whichever metaphor we choose, as we just heard from Jose. And here I want to talk specifically about the environmental changes and impacts of development in this sense. When we talk about urban development, what comes to mind is the platting of new neighborhoods, the extension of sewerage infrastructures, the building of new schools, factories. These are all things that are potentially consistent and important to the achievement of either narrow economic development or the broader search for improvements in human welfare. But since the suite of major environmental statutes that passed between 1965 and 1980, what a law professor of mine used to call the 7 wonders of environmental law: Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, CIDWA, Safe Drinking Water Act, Endangered Species Act, Wilderness Act. We call them the 7 wonders because, like, medieval Europeans looking at the pyramids or thinking about the Colossus at Rhodes, they thought we could think, how would we build those today? How Clean Air Act would not get out of committee today. Clean Air Act passed unanimously in the Senate and 1 vote against it in the House of Representatives in 1970. And that guy, I think, would just press the wrong button. We're pretty sure. So since we have this architecture of federal law, we recognize that development can cause systematic problems with the environment that sustains us. This part of the process that concerns me is the encounter between urban development and the wetland and aquatic landscape that surrounds us, that sustains the ecology of our biomes, provides water for drinking, sanitary, agricultural, industrial uses, and filters and contains our pollutants. As we can see, there's quite a history of impact to wetlands and waters near cities. So here you can see yourselves on this map. You might see where you live, and you can see that much of Madison was originally wetland. Much of it is still lake, of course. But anywhere there's flat land, you're pretty much in wetlands, or former wetlands. If you look at Boston, if any of you are familiar with Boston, much of that is on filled coastal wetlands. Any of you Red Sox fans or been to a baseball game in, what is it called? What's the stadium? Fenway. Fen, kind of a wetland, built in the Back Bay, which was a bay. This is not an unreasonable thing to expect in almost any major city. So San Francisco, large neighborhoods built on wetlands. In fact, the prospect in 1960 was that much of the bay was going to be filled because flat land is so rare. That in 1960, prior to the Clean Water Act, the idea was we might just have a river. If you're from New York, the battle was not whether to fill wetlands, it was whether to fill the East or the Hudson rivers. I imagine this was a battle between people from Queens and Jersey. But this is not an unreasonable set of things to think about engineering throughout the 20th century. The premise of much of the environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s was this had to stop, that there was going to be a hard stop to development. The Club of Rome, a group of international economists saying growth must end. You had, and I can never resist a chance to put up Elliot Richardson, who many of you might recognize as the Attorney General who resigned out of principle rather than fire Archibald Cox, a special prosecutor in Watergate, but in fact was also, from my standpoint, more important as the Commerce Secretary under President Ford, said, yeah, this attention to the environment might halt economic development, period. But in practice, as you can see from his language, it was recognized that it's impractical and in fact impossible to stop. Stopping development would bring immediate material misery to billions of people, but also represent an abandonment of the lofty goals that I mentioned just a moment ago. And so you see the sentiment expressed in the major pieces of federal legislation. Let's stop. It should be illegal. We're going to stop development. But in all of these, a door was left open to go ahead and harm the environment if you can justify carefully and do something about it under carefully controlled circumstances. Development must continue, and that's what all these accepts are about. And so we arrive at that great American innovation in environmental policy, mitigation. Well, this is a word that has cropped up in your experience. I'm enough of an amateur linguist, I always love to go back to the Latin root. To lighten, to soften, to make civilized. I think it's one of my favorite senses of the word, to soothe, to alleviate. And so with all of these exceptions open the door to harm, to say, yes, we are going to harm the environment. We cannot stop. As long as we're going to do that, we are going to mitigate those harms. And so environmental mitigation is sort of the answer to the inevitable harms of development. What does mitigation look like? It's the idea that we consider measures that will alleviate, soften, civilize, and require measures that will lighten or soothe the impacts of the environment. So my area is wetland policy. I used to work for the Environmental Protection Agency and developing policy on what can you do to mitigate impacts to wetlands. First of all, I want to tip my hat to a scholar named Len Chapman, who is really the dean, the grand old man, the grise eminence of wetland economics and policy, a true believer in the ideology of economics, who says, in effect, it's the landscape that's got it wrong. We may have to rearrange things to get them out of the way of development. The landscape may be organized inefficiently. It does not follow that preservation of a particular existing wetlands in time and space yields the greatest benefit. It may be desirable to rearrange the landscape. And that is often what we do geographically in the pursuit of mitigation. To keep what is good without destroying it, but still achieve those goals, whether narrowly economic or broadly humanitarian, of development. To not give up on the promise of development, but still preserve the environment. So in part, mitigation is a geographic strategy of arranging things so that our streets and our schools are not in the way of our wetlands and rivers. Or vice versa, it depends kind of what you care more about. It often requires you to believe that we can recreate what is important about wetlands and rivers and species habitat in new places. To believe in the science and the practice of wetland restoration, for example. And I could talk for a long time about whether or not we can restore wetlands. If I went off on that tangent, we'd be here for another few hours, and I don't think we want that. But if you want to build a housing complex, or whatever it is you want to build, and it turns out that you want to build it, where you want to build it is on a protected wetlands, or other water of the United States, you will go to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to get a permit, a Section 404 permit, to do so. That's Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And because development must continue, they will certainly give you a permit, as they do in, this is going to sound like a fake statistic, but it's not, 99.6% of all permit applications are approved. But they will approve it, but they will require mitigation. Here's your permit. Now you mitigate. Often this will include the requirement that you restore an amount of wetlands that is equal to or greater than the amount that you are proposing to destroy. That is sometimes called a wetland mitigation site. Now, you can do this yourself, but you're a housing developer. You're not good at restoring wetlands, and you're not really interested in being responsible for their long-term maintenance in perpetuity. it's just not what you want to do with your time and money. So currently, most mitigation happens now when you, as the person who wants to fill a wetlands, actually goes to somebody who already has, somebody called a wetland banker. A wetland banker has gone off and acquired a large piece of territory, not that size, but something small within that. A large territory they've restored to wetlands, and they are allowed to sell you a credit to represent your compliance with the permanent condition that says you have to mitigate. So, not sure if I'm going to make the, yeah. So this little wetland site here can sell credits to impacts that occur anywhere within this area. Little tiny wetland site in there can sell impacts to all the sell credits to all the impacts that occur within that area, and it's called a service area. So that's a system that has dominated the practice of mitigation for wetlands impacts for the past 20 years. Oh, where's my figure? And so you see the developed landscape of environmental mitigation emerging in places like Chicago. So this is the 7-county metro area around Chicago. Plenty of wetlands, plenty of development. Where do the wetlands go to get out of the way of Chicago? That's a geographic question. And what happens is that in the smallest water, so this is a map of the watersheds in the Chicago district. You can see that for most of the watersheds where there is any wetland filling or wetland policy activity, you've got loss. Mostly small, but some fairly large acreages of loss. And a few hotspots of gain. That's where the wetland banks are. So you're transforming and developing this landscape in response to the need to, the wetland landscape, in response to the need to develop the human landscape. So you've got hotspots of loss and hotspots of gain through the practice of mitigation. And this kind of rearrangement with development is something we now see with all kinds of environmental impacts. The faith that we can and must allow development and then mitigate the consequences is not now just an American practice. It did definitely begin as an American policy practice, but is used as a governing principle throughout the world. You find it at all levels, voluntary, regulatory, in almost every country. The mitigation of California red-legged frog habitat, for example, by buying a frog credit. You can buy frog credits. In a habitat bank, it might be 100 miles away. You can buy a California red-legged frog credit near Sacramento for the impact up in the Modoc National Forest. Rearranging the landscape. The offsetting of carbon emissions that may occur in Madison, but are mitigated in Indonesia when you pay for the planting of trees in Indonesia. Almost always, you're going to create a hotspot of gain and a hotspot of loss as you rearrange that landscape. Whatever it is we're trying to manage, we'll begin to respond to forces like real estate prices or local planning and zoning regulations that you would not think are relevant to frog habitat, but turn out to be. So rearranging our landscapes by mitigation is almost certainly better than destroying them without heed to what is lost. But we should learn about the geography of development that emerges from that practice. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so much to our presenters. I feel like after a night of SoundWaves, I feel like I'm a little smarter. I think my family probably disagrees with that. But there's so much to learn out there, and our researchers here at UW are so incredible. As so often happens, we raise up the screen at this point because we're no longer looking at things, we're listening to things as we talk about music and the world of sound. And our musician tonight is Tom Curry. He's our tuba professor. He is my colleague in 2 different brass ensembles, and he's an amazing tuba player, and you're going to be very lucky to have a chance to hear him. What's interesting here in particular, though, is that the piece he's playing is a piece he wrote for himself. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. And I want you to imagine yourself as a composer writing for yourself. So the material which we are sculpting in music is sound, but not just sound in the abstract, but a particular sound. So if you write for yourself and you play the oboe, then you're working in the world of oboe sound. Or for me, I work in the world of French horn sound. But I also write electronic music, and I have, based on my computer, I have thousands of sounds that I can work with. And any particular sound that you hear might give you a hint about what it wants to do. Just like if you create a character, because you're writing a story or a novel, that character starts to tell you something about what's going to happen to that character. We have a young man. He is 18 years old. He's going off to college. All right, well, now we have a particular set of circumstances that we can imagine that that young man is going to face, and now our novel starts to write itself. In the case of writing a piece for yourself, if you're a tuba player, you have the tuba sound, and we start with a note. And every piece starts with a note. And so you choose what note you want. And then it's a simple matter because then you need to choose what the next note is. But there's more subtlety to it than that because we need to know how long is the first note going to last? And when is it going to go to the next note? And then we want to know how loud are these notes? Are they the same? Are they different? How does the note start? Does it start with a strong attack? Does it start gently? And now we have our first two notes, and we've made these decisions, and then we need a third note. But we also have to think not about just, okay, I have three notes, but does anybody want to listen to these three notes? What is it about these three notes that engages people? So maybe we develop a little rhythm for the three notes that we find catchy. And maybe that rhythm wants to be repeated, or maybe that rhythm wants not to be repeated. So we have to think about how much sameness do we want to make the listener understand, feel comfortable? I recognize this territory. This is a wetland. I know where I am. And how much do we want change? This was a wetland. Now it's something different. Sometimes we want to portray strife. There's been an invasion of something new. We have a cancer coming into our melody that's forcing it to change. But sometimes we want to rely on the comfort of repetition. So what we're going to do, we're going to build a piece right now. Tom and I are going to do that. Come on up, Tom. And we're going to build a little bit of a piece. And what's interesting about this is in music, we have a crutch. And that crutch is notation. We actually have an incredible system of notation for writing down what a piece should sound like. And there's infinite variations when you have a printed piece of music on what it will sound like. Because if it says F sharp and it says that it should be played piano, meaning quiet, that's a relative thing. And F sharp, that's a relative thing too, because we can move notes, pitches by teeny, teeny little fractions. So nothing is set in stone. But we're not going to use notation right now. We're going to just use our brains to think about what notes we want, what rhythms we want. But this also involves memory. And as you probably know, and maybe you've thought about this, listening to music involves memory very much. So I always like to use Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which almost everybody knows, and it's such a famous piece, but it's so tightly composed, that first movement. Everything is based on ba-ba-ba-ba, and it becomes almost like a little unit of memory. And we see it coming back in various guises, always triggering our memory so that when it changes, we get it, and when it repeats, we also get it. So in this case, because we have nothing written down, we're going to have to write a little piece for you that's memorable. So we're going to have some challenges here. And our first challenge is going to be to figure out what the first note we want to play is. And I think Tom is going to get to choose what the first note is. We're going with an A. So that's an A. Anybody here have perfect pitch? Do you know what perfect pitch is? If you had perfect pitch, you would have known that was an A. What color is this? How'd you know? because it just is, right? For a person with perfect pitch, that just is an A, and they don't have to think about it. And for instance, I have a friend with amazing perfect pitch, so that if that A was like one vibration slightly faster, so it was just an A is 440, right? The cycle of vibrations is 440 per second. If it was 441, he could tell you that. Not because he's got some kind of slide rule in his brain. He just knows. Just like that's red. And if there were a different red, here's somebody wearing a red shirt over here, we can tell those are different. Perfect pitch is an amazing thing. I don't have it. Tom doesn't have it. Okay, so we have an A. Let's hear that A again. Okay, and we have to think about what octave it's in, because we could hear an A in a different octave, or a different octave. Can we get an even lower one? So we have considerations of range. We also have what we call dynamics. How loud is this A going to be? And this is how loud it's going to be. So it's going to be kind of quiet, right? If we were notating it, we'd put a P for piano, Italian for quiet. Now, by the way, I should mention, Tom had no idea any of this was going to happen. So he's being a very good sport about this. So we have to think about when we have this note, boom, boom, A, quiet. We have to think about what that's going to do next. Because that piece, here's our piece so far. This thing's not going to be on the charts anytime soon, right? We need some more notes. So let's think about what the next note is. What note do you think is going to be next? Yeah. So we're going to go from A to C. Of course, we have to decide if we want to go up from A to C, which we call a minor third, or down from A to C, which we call a major sixth. And Tom will show us what we're going to do. Okay, and is that the rhythm we want? Works for me. Okay, so now, of course, we need another note, and we may think like A to C. That sounds like part of a minor chord, which would be this. But it might be the top part of a major chord, and it would do this. An F major chord? So I'm going to ask our friend Walter, who's been to a million of these sound waves, whether he wants a major or a minor chord to begin this.
Let's do a minor.
So we're going to do a minor chord, and it's going to be quiet. And Tom's got to think of what kind of rhythm we want also for this, because it could be slow, it could be fast, it could be a combination. And we're building what we call a theme, right? We're building a chunk of melody that hopefully will be memorable melody. Okay, this is starting to me to be something that's like, this has a little bit of a life now. So we have a little implied chord. What's interesting, the tuba mostly, there's some technical exceptions, but pretty much plays just one note at a time. And yet, by playing these three notes in a row, we've implied a harmony. We hear it as a harmony. Listen to it again. So now we have to decide, do we want to have another harmony? And the way I'm feeling right now, we want another harmony, right? So we've had this A minor. Now Tom's going to think of another harmony. And now we have to figure out, is there some kind of catchy rhythmic scheme that we can do? Maybe we want the two chunks, the two chords that we've now heard. Even though I'm calling them chords, even though we're going in a horizontal direction, but we hear the verticality of these. So let's come up with a little rhythm that is the same for each of them. All right, so now we got a foundation here for our melody, right? And it's memorable. Now, can you have a little filigree that changes the rhythm? Good. Now, what I'm feeling, and I don't know about you, luckily this is my piece more than your piece, so your piece can be different, but I want to get out of this range. Range refers to how high, how low we're playing, and the tuba has a huge range. It can play way down here, and way up here. So we have this little chunk of melody, which hopefully is memorable enough for Tom to actually remember. And after we have this little 6-note thing, we're going to move to a different part of the tuba range. All right, and as you can see, we have really the materials for an entire piece, because we can develop these materials. So, ba-da-dum, that's like a little meme that gets spread around the internet and people do variations on it. So we have this little bit of material we've developed, and now we're going to take that meme and start doing different stuff. And I'm totally putting Tom on the spot here, because he's got to remembering this stuff is just, it's hard. His brain is about to burst, but here we go. Yeah, and this is the beginning of a piece that actually I would really like to hear. I feel like it has a ton of promise, and I get it, right? I think none of you is out there saying, I don't understand this music. I don't like that modern music. This is terrible, right? This is something that we can grab onto right away. And all it takes is just a little bit of thinking and a little bit of feeling and a little bit of sameness and continuing with the same thing. That's a kind of development. And then changing is also kind of a kind of development. So hopefully Tom can remember pretty close to what he just did, and then there's going to be a big change. And that last note was really cool because he had kind of been in a key, right? It sounded like the kind of music that's located in a key. A lot of contemporary music's not really in a key, like a major key or a minor key, but we're pretty nicely situated in a minor key until that last note was like walking around a corner and the landscape is different. So now Tom's going to do, I don't think he can remember, maybe he can remember all that, but once he comes down to that other note, we're going to have a different landscape. Now we have this melody that's like, first of all, everyone's nodding like, yeah, I get that piece. That's a good piece. Who wrote that piece, right? But it's gone to 2 different rooms of the house, and they're a little bit different, right? So this is now we got all the material, right? Tom could write, if we gave him a week, he could come back with a piece that starts like that. That could be 10 minutes long. We have enough material to develop, to take little snippets, to rearrange them, to move them into a different key, to move them higher, to move them lower, to change how loud, how soft. These are the tools which composers use to sculpt their piece. And sometimes they want to write something that's not at all in a key, which would sound something like this. But notice that even though we're not going, oh, that's in G minor or that's in E flat major, we don't hear it that way, but still there's a emotional content of the line that he's played that gets us involved. It doesn't hurt that he's an amazing tuba player, right? So we just love listening to the sound. But this is the kind of clay that we're shaping to build a piece. And what's great is when you're writing yourself a piece, then you go on, what kinds of playing express your own personality. So Tom could write a piece that didn't express his tuba personality at all, that would sound something like this. Right? That's a very non-Tom Curry kind of a piece. On the other hand, if he had a piece in which he wanted to express mockery, he might go to that exact spot. Right? So we have this palette. I was over at the restaurant before. They had the Bob Ross, still the Bob Ross painting channel is always on the TV over there at the restaurant. And he's always saying, this is your special world, and you can put a fir tree here if you want. And this is kind of the way in which composers operate, and they know they have their own palette, right? So Tom has a completely different palette available, and this is what it sounds like. You guys have a different palette entirely. A much more creepy palette, right? By the way, that last thing that Tom did is playing and singing at the same time. I told you that we can only play one note at a time. We can play and sing at the same time and make some really cool sounds. So that's really cool, right? It's an amazing sound. And this is one of the things that when I'm saying, like, when we write for ourselves, we know what we can do. And Tom knows he can make that sound, so he can make that into a piece as well. So full disclosure, I have not heard the actual piece that Tom is going to play right now. I have no idea what it's going to sound like. I have played music that Tom wrote, and it's amazing. But I at least want you to get into the head of somebody who's writing music for himself or for herself, and the kind of tools that we use and the way in which we use development to try to tell a story that is in some way coherent, and we get to define our own coherency, right? We get to this. There are many different kinds of stories that have their own coherencies, and we're always trying to reach the audience and have them tune into what we're feeling and have an emotional response. So with that said, I present Tom Curry.
All right, so I wanted to tell you a few things about this piece and sort of explain how this process that Dan outlined applies to this piece and just kind of give you something to listen for. So I always think of myself as being better at coming up with ideas than at writing music. So what I tend to do is I have a need for something, or I have an idea about something and how I want to represent that thing musically, and I let the piece kind of unfold from there. This piece is called Linea Fractura, or Fracta. I don't speak Latin at all, so if that's horrible Latin, that's what it is. It means broken line, or something similar to broken line. This piece came about, I had a recital that I was doing that dealt with different concepts of time. So time on a cosmic scale, time on a sort of climate and geographical scale, how we perceive time, how memories and anxieties and our sort of ability to focus influences our sense of how time unfolds. And I actually needed a piece to start this program. So that's what this piece came about. I was thinking about how I could kind of introduce all these concepts in a very sort of bite-sized way. And I had this idea of creating an overture. This is a very common thing that you'll see, say, in an opera. And it might introduce a bunch of themes of the opera. You might hear music in the overture that you're going to hear later on. And so the way I decided to do this was I decided to create these ideas about line and time unfolding and then punctuate those with different things that were going to happen later in the recital. The idea being that you could sort of like maybe not put your finger on what you're hearing that connects to these other things, but that maybe later on in the recital you go, that seems a little familiar. That's weird how that popped up again. So I wanted the two things that I was basing these around, these sort of like lines that I was going to then break, to be really ambiguous and amorphous. In music, especially on accompanied music, we basically have two tools. We have melody and we have rhythm. We can imply harmony, as Dan was saying, but those are our two main tools when we're playing by ourselves. So in tonal music, there's a gravity that comes along with having a center of tone, a tonic note, as we would call it. So if I was to play a B-flat scale, you would hear that there's a pull to B flat. We need it to get to that place. It's a series of half steps and whole steps that pull us toward that. But there are other types of scales that don't have that. And the one that I chose to use in this piece as a sort of basis for this ambiguity that I was mentioning is a whole tone scale. And a whole tone scale doesn't have a series of half steps and whole steps. It's all whole steps. So when you hear that scale, we don't get this strong sense that it's belonging anywhere. In other words, all notes are equal to each other. They're all equal compared to each other, and there's no tonic note. Right, we don't hear that pull that brings us to that. So that's the sort of melodic basis. In terms of rhythm, our center of gravity is typically based around meter. So if we're in 4, you hear that we're in 4 because we go to 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And it becomes this regular thing that you can attach your sense of time to. In this piece, I wanted to sort of get away from that. So the first part that you hear is actually unmetered. There's no time signature to it. It unfolds just kind of in a wandering fashion. The second part of it is very metered, but it comes along in a weird sort of asymmetrical meter. It's in 6/4, so we could divide 6/4 in any number of ways. We could do it by 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2. Or we could do it by sets of 3s. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Or we could do what I decided to do in this piece, which is 2 plus 2 plus 3 plus 2 plus 3. And it's such that you don't really get a sense of where the arrival note is that we're meant to go to. So those are the two main sort of organizing ideas of this piece. And I set those up and kind of play around with them a little bit. And I hope you enjoy this piece, Linnea Fracta.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Please sign up for our mailing list if you want to be on it. And we'll see you in 2025.